All right. Hello and welcome. I am Heather Pierce Campbell, the legal website warrior. I'm an attorney and legal coach based here in Seattle, Washington. Welcome to another episode of Guts, Grit, and Great Business. So today I am super excited to bring you my friend, Paul Zelizer. Paul, welcome. How are you?
Oh, it's so good to be here, Heather. And I'm good, and I'm also just like, wow, humans, wow, life on planet Earth
Uh,
right now, wow. And I'm also really good. So weird mix, but that's how I am.
Well, I appreciate the honesty. And yes, we'll have lots to talk about today. So, for those listening, let me introduce Paul. So, Paul Zelizer is one of the first business coaches to focus on the needs of conscious entrepreneurs and social impact businesses. He also works with leaders to help them increase the transformational impact that they have. Paul is the former director of social media for Wisdom 2.0, one of the premier mindfulness brands in the world. In 2017, he founded Awarepreneurs. Two of the things the company is known for is their popular podcast and the Awarepreneurs community, a dynamic group of hundreds of social and wellness entrepreneurs who support each other in growing their businesses, increasing their positive impact, and practicing self-care. So Paul and I connected through LinkedIn, which is one of my favorite platforms for connecting, and he's been one of my favorite people ever since. So Paul, I'm super excited to be connecting with you today. I love the work that you do. I love the way that you support the folks in your group. Thanks so much for joining.
It's such an honor. And when I heard you were launching a podcast, I was like, Heather, podcasting, put them together. Yes. So anyway, everything you just, thanks for all those nice words. And listeners, if you don't know how awesome Heather Pierce Campbell is, please go find out about what she's doing, because I just love what you do. And when I was like, oh, she's starting a podcast. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. I'll totally pay you later for that nice
Oh
comment.
yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Chocolate works, Heather. Yeah. Just get the nice chocolate, right?
Chocolate, yeah, that's definitely a love language for me. So
Right.
yeah, you've got some more chocolate coming your way. No, and for me, the podcast really, the way that I saw a podcast fitting, because for the longest time, I never actually thought of having a podcast, but I mean, as you know, I love talking to people. I love connecting with people. I love having conversations about business and life. And so I just thought, the more that I thought about it, the more it made sense to just do this in a more structured format and then bring those conversations to the folks that I was already serving. So there you go.
I like to joke. My name is Paul, and I'm podcast obsessed. So you don't need to convince me.
Well, I love that. It has been surprising because I went from literally knowing nothing about how to have a podcast and in 4 weeks had one fully launched and out the door, right? And
Nice.
so it was super fun. The guys that helped me launch it did a great job and they make it so easy and break it down. And now I'm like, yeah, everybody should have a
Everybody
podcast.
should have podcasts. Yeah.
Totally, totally.
Heather and I are just going to toss. Sorry, listeners. We're just going to like rant on podcasts for a while.
No, we really
No, we
won't, but
won't.
we
But
are both fans. I know. Well, Paul, talk to us, backtrack for us. And for people that don't know you, take us back to your roots. Where did you get started? Like when you think back to the path that began years ago and has led you to where you are now, where did that path start?
oh goodness. Personally, professionally, both.
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 Yeah, when you think back to something that really, because I obviously know a little bit about you and your history in social work, and like you have a
Sure.
very, very interesting path.
So when I was 17 years old, there was a conversation that happened that changed the trajectory of my life. And I kind of put a pin on that map, like right there. And what happened was I was in high school and I was, kind of coming off the rails a little bit with drugs and alcohol. And on a particularly bad night, I woke up in the morning feeling really terrible and ashamed about what had happened the night before. And I sat down with a family friend who was a very wise woman. And she said, Paul, she explained my nervous system to me. That's how I
Mm,
talk about it. She said, Paul, you're wired for point-in experiences. You're wired for point-in experiences. And this goes one of two ways. One is you have a lifetime of addiction and drama, and you probably die an early death, right? And you're miserable, a lot of suffering.
Mm.
Or there's these things called awareness practices, right? Something to help you cultivate a sense of balance and aliveness. There's a ton of them out there. I don't care which one you pick, but if you pick one, you'll live a good life. You'll help people, and on your deathbed, you'll feel good about what you did on this earth.
Mm.
Please pick one.
Wow.
And I heard her. She wasn't like, come to my guru. It wasn't a brand attached. It wasn't like, my church is the best. You should like do this or what. She just was explaining my nervous system and helping me kind of understand, I was a football player and a lacrosse player. And like, I just wanted aliveness. And, I heard her. So I'm 52. That was 35 years ago. And 35 years ago, I started on a journey of personal development and learning about meditation and yoga. And um, that conversation changed the trajectory of my life.
Wow. And you said that was a family friend?
Yeah, a friend of my
Yeah.
mom's, actually.
Wow. What a gift.
Such a gift.
What a
Such a
gift.
gift.
So how did you get started, right? So she tells you this thing, gives this message. How did you, of all the options out there, like what did you choose to start with?
Well, I just got really interested in all kinds of different paths of depth.
Mm,
I was hanging out with Father Joe Gilligan, who was an Irish Catholic priest who studied 9 languages, who spoke 9 languages, had traveled the world, and was dying of brain cancer when I met him, right?
mm,
And you could look in Father Joe's eyes and just see the light, and I grew up Jewish, but like I didn't, this guy knew something about living a life of depth and meaning. And I kept hearing people who had that, learned about yoga, meditation, whatever. The word service just kept coming up in so many different paths, including the path that I grew up in as a Jew. And I started in service work and started
mm,
volunteering in a drug and alcohol treatment program for teens when I was still a teen, right? And that led to a number of things, including eventually a 15-year career in social work, doing innovative programs like helping engage young fathers who had kind of started down some path of trouble and get them re-engaged as dads and with their kids and their families, and doing restorative justice and all kinds of just beautiful, hard, complicated service work for
mm.
15 years.
Wow. Well, and what a way to be of service to parents and fathers who need to be there for their children, right? And have the option to change their choices so that they can.
And it was beautiful work. I lived in New Mexico for most of that time. I moved here in
Mm,
1993, so I got to work in the little villages near the Colorado border and work with the Hispanic grandmothers in the Catholic church, because
mm,
in these little towns there was like a school and a church and nothing else, maybe a clinic occasionally, and did a lot of the work on the pueblos of northern New Mexico, the reservation. So it was just fabulous, beautiful, complicated work with lots of intergenerational trauma and cultural tensions, and families who cared about their kids who were, in some trouble. And
mm.
it was beautiful and complicated work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you obviously have a deep, rich history living that work. I mean, since basically you were a teenager.
Exactly. Yeah.
So talk to us, share with us about the transition out of that work and into more of what you're doing now. What did that look like? What sparked that transition?
A couple things. One is I got tired, compassion fatigue. That much
Mm,
trauma and addiction and violence was hard after a while, and I burned out. And I also got tired of being a broke social worker. At
mm-hmm,
this point, I had a kid, and a number of things kind of got my attention. In that, yeah, I was tired, I was burnt out, I had a kid, my work was ending, a marriage I was in to my daughter's mom ended, and I needed to reinvent myself. And at the same time, a friend of mine needed to reinvent himself. His name is Soren Gordhammer, and he became known as the founder of Wisdom 2.0. This was
mm,
before it had started, but we lived across a horse pasture from each other in northern New Mexico, in a little town, a little art community. And he had done things like started a nonprofit that taught meditation and yoga to incarcerated teens, right? And he had a little 9-month-old and I had a 3-year-old, and we were dads who loved our kids who were both getting divorced, and both, my dad called us wisdom do-gooders. We needed to reinvent ourselves pretty fast because we didn't have a lot of money in the bank. And we got on Twitter in 2008 and started back when hardly anybody in New Mexico was on Twitter or using social media. And suddenly we were like, went from the little town that we lived in northern New Mexico, and we were at Zappos talking to Tony Hsieh and the leadership team on the day they were handing out t-shirts saying, thank you for making us $1 billion a year company, because Tony and his team are really interested in positive psychology and how you can use that in a business environment. And then we were at Google. And Google now, it's well known, they have a program called Search Inside Yourself where they teach mindfulness and emotional intelligence. It's been tens of thousands of employees now. Last I heard it was 60,000, but I think it's higher than that now. And the book hadn't come out. Google was playing their cards very close to their chest that they were teaching mindfulness and emotional intelligence. Now they wrote a book and there's a leadership institute, but back in 2009, 2010, nobody was talking about that stuff. But we were on social media, so it was a very small kind of closed system, and people are like, wow, here's some folks who are willing to talk about that, even though they were billion-dollar-a-year CEOs. And I lived in an old Adobe, and Soren lived in a double-wide trailer in a little place called Dixon, New Mexico. We started getting into the conversation, and there was enough relevance from what I had studied in my own personal life and then in the work I did, that even though I didn't know much about business, people who were very, very good at it wanted some of the history and information that we knew from our training. And they shared with us what they know. And when somebody is running a program at Google says, do you want to come and talk to us about that? Say yes.
Yes.
So I said yes a lot.
The takeaway is, yeah. Well, I love that. A couple of wisdom do-gooders that lived across the horse pasture from each other. But it's, what an origin story, right?
It was wild, Heather. What a story, right?
Yeah, that's a great story. So, wow. So you get those experiences at Zappos, at Google. Then what happens? How does that translate into your heart for the entrepreneurs that you work with now?
Well, Soren wrote this book called Wisdom 2.0, which did okay, but not great. But eventually he decided he wanted to launch a conference, and he asked me to come work on the marketing team. And that conference really took off. Now it's a series, well, COVID-19, pre-COVID-19,
Right.
it was a series of conferences all around the world. But at its largest, it was 4,000 plus people in Silicon Valley. And the people who were on the stage were a lot of leaders in tech companies and other large companies, Airbnb and Facebook and the Compassion Initiative at LinkedIn and Google, talking about Search Inside Yourself, along with very well-known spiritual teachers like Eckhart Tolle and Marianne Williamson and Byron Katie, et cetera, right? That was his whole thing. But in the audience, so I was like, all right, whatever. It's kind of cool that Google's teaching this. And if you help a manager at Google or Facebook or Twitter be a little less stressed, the company makes more money. And there are other outcomes that businesses tend to like. Turnover goes down, health insurance costs go down, et cetera, right? But I'm like, sorry, Facebook, sorry, Google, if a Facebook team does better at making money and doing more, selling us more ads, it's not that inspiring to me. Like the fundamental business model of what these companies were doing, some of them I actually think are having harm, and many of them weren't that inspiring to me. But in the audience were all these innovative wisdom and social entrepreneurs who were like excited to see these things happening, but we're doing, at least to me, much more innovative work. And I got much more interested in who was 50 to 60% of the people were solos or 5-person companies or 10-person companies doing this incredibly innovative work. And I was like, I want to talk to these people. And they, we started talking to each other. Where are you gathering? Where's our home? Where do we have the kind of conversations that are happening on the big stage at Wisdom 2.0 for Google and Facebook and Twitter. Where do we go for that? And that one thing led to another, and suddenly people were hiring me to be their business coach who had those kind of businesses.
I love that. Well, and I love that, it's fascinating because I always like to ask people about their path into entrepreneurship, and people who are there also all tend to have these massive hearts for entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah.
If you've walked the path and you've lived in that space, and so I love knowing more now about how you got there. So talk to us now about present and the work that you are doing, either with folks in your group or the variety of things that you're up to.
Sure. Before we go there, I just want to say,
Yeah.
if you're a listener and like, I started the conversation like I needed to reinvent myself, but I want to say it was messy. I don't want to like smooth out the man. If you want to email me and ask about that, I don't want to tell you war stories if you don't need to hear them. But let me just say, this was not the like, oh, it just fell in some ways it is kind of cool. But it was not this like magic snap my fingers from social worker to social entrepreneur and all the work fell out of the sky. There were lean years, especially at the beginning, and
Yeah.
I made mistakes and I had to get training, and some of the training didn't work very well in terms of the kinds of people I wanted to work with. There were traditional coaches and business advisors that were making suggestions for sectors that are very, very different than the social entrepreneur sector that I really was working with. It was messy and
Yeah.
complicated. So I don't want to disappear that before we like, oh, let's talk about what it looks like now.
No, right. I appreciate you pausing there. I do like to look back and ask, like, what were the points that you hit that felt really hard or like you wanted to give up, right? Because people do tend to look at what's happening now and only see that. I mean, from the outside looking in, right? But no, I appreciate you saying that, because anybody who's been on the path and made big transitions like that in their life, I mean, I think that there's a lot to relate to there. A lot of times it doesn't just land in your lap or happen in the way that you think it might go, even when you're clear on what you want to be doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what it looks like now is I basically have two businesses that are related but separate. In paulzelizer.com, I do one-on-one and small group coaching for social entrepreneurs and wellness entrepreneurs, and some increasingly leaders who are running, 10-person to 100-person, small to medium-sized businesses. And that's pretty traditional, one-on-one, or my groups are 6 people in a groups, typically for 6-month coaching contracts.
And
And
what are the kinds of things from the client side that they're wanting to tackle? Like, what's in their mind when they come to you and say, hey,
yeah,
we want to take this next step? What are they asking you for?
it's a great question. The one-on-one work is typically a business. I'm thinking of one woman. They've kind of maxed out what they can do with the existing business model. So I'm thinking of somebody who had a mindfulness-based business, and she was literally seeing 32 people a week. She didn't even have time to return the phone calls of the new people who were calling in because there was so much interest. She had been at it a while, and it was time for a new business model, but she had been trained, let's call her a coach, she'd been trained in coaching, which usually is a one-on-one kind of arrangement, and she rocked it. But like, it was time for a new evolution, but she was so busy, and she was in
Just
this gerbil wheel of doing the service and answering the calls and scheduling everything herself and doing her newsletter all by herself. And she was literally doing 32 people a week plus all these, her own bookkeeping. She just like, I literally can't do this. I can't even call back the other people.
yeah.
And she wanted to get into doing groups and retreats and other, I call them leveraged offerings, something that, people come to me around when they're launching a book, when they have an online course, they want to do a membership community. That's who my one-on-one clients typically are. They've got something up and running, but they're ready for more impact, and they're also working really hard because the business models that are good for us when we're up and when we're getting starting, right? that's actually a great business model when you're starting, because you don't have to have 100 people in an online course. It's really hard when nobody
Yeah,
knows who you are to get 100 people in a course,
that's right.
right? It's actually not a great business model for most people when they start. But one-on-one's a great thing, because one person says yes and you say, great, here's my agreement. When you hit that PayPal or, Venmo or whatever, you pay me in Bitcoin, right? It's all good and we're good to go, right?
Yeah.
At a certain point, it doesn't work, and for where people are trying to go, and that's who tends to hire me one-on-one. The people who are in my small groups tend to be a little earlier on in their business development. And they're doing okay, they're like paying the bills, but just barely. They're not saving much, they're working hard, and they tend to be in spaces that what we would call saturated, so it's not as easy
Mm,
to get business. If you're a coach, it was easier to start a business as a coach 15 years ago than it is now, for example. So somebody who's like good at what they do, but they can use a little help to make it more unique and get to not just like barely paying the bills or paying the bills, but not a lot of extra, to like, more space, more ease, and more options.
yeah. So you're basically bringing some, sounds like combination of some business fundamentals and like strategic coaching applied to folks in the socially conscious, aware
Absolutely.
space.
Yep.
Yes.
I ask all my clients in that part of the work I do 4 questions. Why? In this order. If you answer these questions in this order, we can come up with something that's likely to work for you. Why? What's your purpose and your values?
Mm,
Your who, right? Mentor of mine says when you try to help everybody, you're going to wind up helping nobody. Your what are the specific offerings? And because you ask who before what, the technical name for it is product market fit, right? Making
mm-hmm.
sure that your offerings are well crafted and understand who you're trying to help and what they are looking for change and help with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the last thing is how, and that's the marketing strategies that most people treat as what I call it marketing by shiny object syndrome, right? Oh my God, Heather and Paul were saying podcasting's like rocking right now. It's true, podcasting is. At a certain point when coronavirus hit, you couldn't even buy a podcast mic because everybody was all sold out, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yes, podcasting's super popular and listens are up around the world, but if you just grab onto the strategy itself without the deeper work of your why, your who, your what, then you're just chasing after marketing strategy. So that's the work that I do with clients, is help dig down into each of those buckets and make sure that we sync it all up so that it's cohesive. And when you do that work, it just has a resonance that most people don't do that work. I want to be an
Mm,
entrepreneur. I want to be a coach. I got this great technology. I'm just going to they know their what, and then they're searching for their how, but they haven't
mm,
really dialed in their who and their why. So when clients do that homework and really kind of have a cohesive thing that each layer builds on the layer before it, that's the work that I do with people.
what do you love about that work?
Oh, the people that I work with are just freaking awesome, Heather. They're just awesome. And the care and the depth and the intentions to make a world a better place is just, every cell in their being is steeped in that intentionality. I don't work with
Mm,
people who are just like, I want to make a ton of money and I want to drive a fancy
mm.
car. I don't do that. Go away. Go find one of those bro internet marketers. Like, I'm busy, right?
Right,
People I
right.
work with are really deeply committed to
Mm,
transforming some pretty stuck patterns on planet Earth.
yeah, yeah. Do you feel like, and you can tell me no to this question or go away or don't ask the
Go
question, right?
away.
I know,
Don't
but
ask me a hard question, Heather. I only want like really like easy softball questions.
well, because I think I serve some of these same people, right? And the ones who so deeply care about what they're doing. Do you think, is there any part that of that equation where you sense that because of that care, they're at a disadvantage in business?
Hmm, that's a great question. I I've fondly started to refer to myself and certain clients, people who know me a little bit. I started calling myself the lovingly pushy New York Jew business coach, right? No, I don't think they're at a disadvantage. I actually think it's an advantage, except when you have a story that it's a disadvantage.
Yes, this
And
is
so
what.
part of my work is to kind of shake that up. And actually, we're seeing this actually. Um, there's a great company that through Awarepreneurs, which we haven't touched on yet, but I can tell you about. We have a partnership going on. In the investment space, there's a company called Conscious Capital Wealth Management. It's an investor
Mm,
company, really smart folks. A colleague of mine, Greg Berry, is a key employee there. One of the things that Conscious Company Wealth Management has been talking about, that in the massive disruption that we're in because of COVID-19 and social unrest and the economic cliff that we've gone off of, companies that are values driven, you can use the lingo, that
mm-hmm,
are ESG and environmental and social governance, paying attention to the environment and social benefit outcomes baked into the DNA of the company, not just a little, we're going to put a little green lipstick on a pig and call ourselves a green company, but we're
right.
talking about deep, deep, baked
Commitment.
into their DNA. Those companies have navigated this change massively better than
Mm,
companies that have not been paying attention to environmental and social governance. Not just a little bit, we're talking it's a profound, the more disrupted the economy gets and the more turbulent things get,
mm-hmm,
the more people are asking questions about values.
right.
So part of my job is to like say to a client, I love that your values align, but this story that it kind of hampers your ability to make money and provide for your family. Let's take a look at the research. And actually, I get it. And there is a way in which dominant culture business, single bottom line, the money is all that matters,
Mm-hmm,
has dominated business. But we're in a new time, and that's not true anymore. Those
mm,
companies are the ones that are suffering, and the ones that have done the work to really articulate their why, their values, and their purpose and their impact statement, they are thriving in a way that the companies that haven't done this. So there's a new reality we're in, but there's an old mindset about that that many people in our space are still working with. And sometimes my job is to just say, let's take a look at the data, and with a lot of
mm-hmm.
love, it's time to get rid of that story because it's actually getting in the way both of you helping people and of you being able to take care of your family.
Mm. Well, I love that. I feel like there's so much we could dig into on that one point. And do you think, let me start by asking, do you think that the reason those, right, what you call the ESG companies, the environmental and socially, social governance focused companies, do you think the reason they're doing well is because consumers are paying attention to that, or because they're actually engaging in better business strategies because of that awareness, or both?
But yeah, my best understanding is it's both.
It's both. Yeah.
That the old economy of cheap energy and cheap products and not thinking about long-term value, it's not, the dollars and cents aren't adding up,
Yeah.
as the technical term, externalized cost, right? All these things that we
Mm-hmm.
pay with our tax money or whatever, and these companies that are doing business in harmful ways, they tend to find some way that taxpayers or that the commons are collective forests and
Yeah.
water and air, they externalize these costs. Even with externalizing them, we just did this massive bailout in the US and gave a lot of money to some companies that I certainly am not aligned with values wise, because they can't make it
Right.
without these massive buyouts and
Right.
payoffs and stuff. And the companies that are, companies like Patagonia or Organic Valley or other companies like that, not that they haven't felt some shockwaves to this, but they're doing just fine.
Yeah.
They have a great product. They aren't externalizing costs, and the people that use these companies
Are
love
loyal.
them. They're
Love
loyal.
them.
They'll pay
Yes.
3 times as much for a Patagonia jacket because they understand the quality and the way that they look at every fabric, every dye that they use, how they ship it to market, the packaging. They're looking at these environmental, social issues and making choices accordingly. And their customers are like, we understand it costs more, but we're willing to do that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's interesting. I actually just spoke yesterday to the woman that designed Patagonia's zero waste
Oh,
program. Yeah,
nice.
back in the
Nice.
90s.
Cool.
But I love, well, and I mean, there's so much in what you say, because I do think it's a very multifaceted equation of how this all lines up, and trying to take that and take really the golden nuggets, especially to people who are not necessarily in a big company, or even in, a smaller mid-sized company. They're building their own thing. They're a scrappy solopreneur. They've got a
Yeah.
small team, right? What do you say to those folks? Because my experience, right, is, and part of my perspective, I mean, my whole goal around bringing the Legal Website Warrior and legal supports to small businesses that need them, because they're not otherwise served by the traditional legal market, but they need these tools to be successful and to have
Yes.
to have longevity, right, in business. But is that some of those folks in this very heart-centered, service-oriented space can have some challenges around building in the supports that they need, putting in the structure that they need, right? But
Yeah.
absolutely, I'm so supportive of their mission, and I want them to have more influence in the world. I want them to make more money so they can be influential. And I really see the money conversation around influencing for good, the things that they
Yes.
want to influence.
It's really hard to influence for good when you're like freaking out about how you're going to buy dinner tonight, right?
Yes.
Really hard. Really
Yes.
hard. Yeah.
Yeah. So for those folks, how does that conversation go? I mean, is it, and I'm sure it looks different business to business, but is that really just more of some business fundamentals and how you grow a business? And
Right. Again, that's why I like this really simple structure, that if somebody will like pause on the what and the how just for a second, because we
Mhm.
tend to be obsessed about that, right? I'm very goal oriented, and I'm great. Now, the how matters, right? If you're
Yeah.
going to do podcasting, let's get really, really good at podcasting, right? And then there's some people who do it better than other people, right? And they tend to get better business results. But the why and the who, like really,
The same
it's
conversation.
the same
Yeah, it's the
conversation
same
coming back to
conversation.
those, and then making sure there's product market fit. And once you have somebody who's starting, the image I use, Heather, is if we can get somebody on the freeway, think about learning to drive. There's that whole thing of you like turn on the key, and then you're like and you have your license, but you've never driven alone before. There's a process of just turning on the key and getting on the road. I oftentimes will say to client, even if you're heading in the wrong direction, you're still driving. And that's different than sitting in the driveway thinking about driving, right? So
Yes.
like if we, what I would say is if we can get somebody like understand your values, think about who you're trying to help and who you're there to serve, think about your product or your service and really design it as best you know how. And then it's lean startup, like iterate your way to success. And
Test,
if we
test,
could just
test.
get you on the highway and in conversations with real humans, and some of them will buy and some of them won't, and at the beginning your conversion rate is probably going to be lower than it is. I'm 13 years in business. If I talk to somebody on the phone and they're seriously considering a business coach, my conversion rate's like 80%. It didn't used to be 80%, right?
Mhm.
We get you on the highway and we get you driving, you're going to get better at it. Your product will get better. Your service will get better. You'll get better as a marketer. You'll meet people like Heather who are awesome connectors. Go connect with Heather on LinkedIn if you're not. She's a fabulous
Woohoo!
connector, right?
And I'm a big fan of LinkedIn. Yes, happy to
Yeah, so
connect
that's
with
how we
anybody there.
met. And LinkedIn is
Totally.
awesome. Go check out LinkedIn. You'll get better at it. But like sitting in the driveway or reading another book about driving, at a certain point, you turn on the key, you put it into drive, or you get it into first gear if you've got a manual,
Yes.
and let's get you on the highway. And when somebody's actually having real world experience of being an entrepreneur, making their first sale, or getting to that point where they're finally at replacement income, whatever their job was before, now they can say, oh yeah, I really didn't do a great job with legal. It's time for me to go buy one of Heather's packages and stop talking about buying it. And like, I don't have to choose between dinner tonight and getting some help with legal, right?
Right. Yeah, it's key. Well, and I love your analogy, because it's really true that You don't grow in business without the doing part. You have to be taking the action and doing and iterating and iterating and iterating.
And making some messes.
And making some messes and hitting a few
Oops.
telephone poles, maybe. Yes, hopefully not too
Oops.
many. Yeah.
Hopefully not too many. Yeah.
Maybe a mailbox, who knows?
Yes,
Thinking
yeah.
of all the driving experiences in my family with 6 kids, right?
Right. Yeah. There's a couple scratches on the mirror and you just know that's going to happen. And hopefully it's, a scratch on the mirror, kind of a oops, as opposed to,
Yeah.
having some people who have some experience in startup and in the business development process can just say, all right, yeah, you might still get a few scrapes on the bumper here, but we're going to try to keep you from hitting a tree at 97 miles an hour.
Totally, totally. Well, and the thing, I mean, the piece that I love, and I'm glad to hear your answer because I truthfully wasn't sure which way it would go, but the really heart-centered folks who are so committed to their path because it's really an expression of their purpose, right? For a lot of these folks, and it's my belief that entrepreneurship can be, if this is the way we choose to use it, not only some of the greatest expression in our life of like our greatest personal expression, but also our greatest expression of good in the world. And
Yeah.
which is why I'm so committed to helping people in this space. And the interesting part about that, it's a little bit what you and I were talking about before we hit record about work having meaning.
Yeah.
Helps us with the grit part of the equation.
It
Right?
does.
Entrepreneurship is not like a try one thing one time and, end
I
up where
like
you
to
want to
joke,
be.
parenting and entrepreneurship are the greast personal development courses you never knew you were signing up for, right? Like you are gonna learn some things. And
Totally.
some of them are gonna be really, really, really uncomfortable.
Right. And you better have some grit to make it through the hardest of those times. And
Yeah.
if you don't find meaning in your work or create meaning through you, I think that path becomes so much more challenging than it already is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's
Viktor Frankl's work, if anybody's looking for some, been talking with a bunch of people. My men's group, we did a very significant conversation. If anybody doesn't know who Viktor Frankl was, he was in a Nazi concentration camp as a Jew. And that time was incredible, years. I forget how many years, but years. This was not a overnight stay, right? He was there for years. And one of the things Viktor Frankl, the book is called Man's Search for Meaning. And in that book, he talks about the difference between people who were in the concentration camp who had a sense of meaning and what he called the overly optimistic. That person who's like, oh, we're going to be fine and this is just going to be short term and everybody's going to be okay. And he said the overly optimistic broke first and they died. The rainbows and the unicorn folks with COVID-19 and social unrest and going off an economic cliff, I'm just watching them. They can't find that grit, to use I love that word, to like, and instead of like overly optimistic, positive thinking, what Viktor Frankl encouraged us to do in challenging times is to focus on meaning and purpose. What are your values? What's your impact? And that, even if it's hard and we're in challenging times, will get us out of bed in a more engaged, steady way. And I think this is particularly true in sort of the more personal development, follow your bliss. Like it has not always been fun in 13 years of figuring my business out and working with people. It's been hard and some really painful stuff has happened. If I was following my bliss, I wouldn't be here.
You'd be at a chocolate factory,
I'd be
right?
a chocolate factory. I don't know where I'd be, but I
I'd
wouldn't
be there
be there.
too.
But I followed my purpose and I followed my values. And Viktor Frankl said those are much more sustainable and they tend to lead towards much more positive impact over the long haul than the people who are trying to follow their bliss.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and I love that you brought that up as an example. So one of I think it was outside of the welcome episode to this podcast, my next episode was on grit. One of the books I talked about was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And there's a segment of that book that I read. And the interesting thing was even the language he used, because yes, if you can attach meaning and you have, meaning to your life, to your purpose, right? And that's a really big conversation. But he made a statement about even if you just are focused on the next task, right? And it was the word task. It wasn't like project or anything huge. It was task.
Blissful experience.
Right. That small amount of purpose can mean literally the difference of like making it another day or not.
Yeah.
And he gave his own experience about having that manuscript destroyed right before he was sent off to the concentration camp. And in his mind, knowing he needed to write that again, like that, he had that as like the thing that he needed to do. And anyways, when I related that story and I thought about that, because part of it was like, do I, yes, that rang true for me, because I remember, and I had a near-death experience myself. I mean, totally different, not on parallel in any way to Victor's experience, but I had a procedure that went wrong on the way to becoming a mom, and I bled out a whole bunch of blood into my abdomen. And right before I was headed to the hospital, because I knew something was really badly wrong, and I just looked, and I kept passing out, but I looked at my husband, I was like, you got to get me to the hospital. And the doctor just kept telling us to lay down on the couch, that I was dehydrated. I would have died if I had taken her advice. But before I left for the hospital, I remember having this thought, and my husband basically had to carry me. But I remember like one of my last thoughts before I totally blacked out was like, I am not going anywhere. I have got a Dan Kennedy workshop to be at in 2 weeks, and that is going to help me serve more people in my bit. Like it was the next thing, that was, and I just remember being like, no, hell no, I'm not going anywhere. I got to be at that workshop. Anyways, long story short, like I'd lost a lot of blood into my abdomen. Like by the time I got to the hospital, I hardly had a pulse, and I survived, obviously, and I went to the workshop. I'm sure that I was not supposed to be flying because my abdomen was still full of blood, but I got on a plane and I went to that workshop.
Wow.
But it was the next thing for me that I was just so committed to making happen. And like, I think the power of that is, even if in small ways we can attach what we're doing to something more meaningful, to something bigger, And there's a quote, I think it comes from the Angela Duckworth book, about the difference between a bricklayer when you ask them like what they're working on, right? Laying a brick versus like building a house of God, right? The perspective in that of like how we attach meaning to our work. And so I love that. And I think it gives people in this space a huge leg up when it comes to the commitment levels they have to their work, and to longevity, and to figuring out a path to make it work. So I, for one, am so grateful for people like you that help them on their path and make that an easier path.
My best. I do my best.
I know, that's all we can do. So a couple things before we wrap up. One, I want to ask you, because you've got your own podcast, and I know you've been doing an amazing job of showing up for other people on their podcast, just like you're doing here. What are you finding in that experience? What are you enjoying about it?
Which side? I call it both sides of the mic.
Yeah,
being a host,
one.
being a guest,
or both. Particularly the being a guest part, right? Because you get to bring your message into new places.
Yeah. So being a guest, I think, is the single most underrated and yet powerful marketing strategy that nobody's talking about, but should be. And the thing about being a guest, that we just published episode 139 today or something like that. So 3 years, we're now publishing twice a week. So like, I'm really down for it as a host. Like, there aren't too many podcasts in our space that publish twice a week, right?
Right. Well, and really quick on the podcasting statistics, because I know that they went through a big uptick, because of COVID, and actually even right before COVID. I think end of 2018, we were at like 900,000 podcasts. And then end of 2019, it was like, it was 500,000 podcasts. And then 2019, before COVID,
we're
was
at
900. Yes, right. Yeah. Almost at the million mark. It was 900,000. And then after COVID started, 1.1 million. But if you actually look at the statistics, only 300,000 of those total are actually actively producing episodes.
Exactly. The average podcast only lasts till about episode 7, right?
Yes.
So if you stick with it, congratulations, Heather. You're at the whatever, some upper end of the curve, right? Just but if you stick with it as a host, that's another whole order of thing about how being. But if you're not sure yet, or you're newer, a
Mhm.
podcast is a long build.
Yes.
If you're looking to get rich quick, or like have clients fall out of the sky with episode 3 or even episode 12, I got news for you. It ain't happening.
It's
You
a
can do
long
all the
play.
things. You can have all the beautiful graphics and great sound quality and awesome guests. And it's a long build strategy.
Yes.
The
Yes.
thing about being a guest is it's not necessarily a long build strategy. If you're really wise about who you approach being, somebody's been holding the space as a host, in my case, for 3 years and 139 episodes or whatever. Some people, somebody I was in recent conversation with, he has an entrepreneur podcast with 5 million subscribers on iTunes.
Wow.
And he needs guests like, I forget if he publishes once or twice a week, but we're talking like 50 guests a year, 100 guests a year, right?
Yeah.
He's looking for people doing innovative things, and he's got 5 million subscribers. He's been building it, I think, for 7 years in his case. Even if it's not 5 million and a podcast gets 1,000 downloads every episode, some get 10,000, even if they get 100, right? Imagine if somebody said to you, I got this great conference of people who are absolutely passionate and want to know more about this thing that you're an expert in. And I'm going to put 5,000 people in a room. I can't pay you, Heather, but these people are raving fans for the exact topic that you are an expert in. And I can't pay you, but I'll put you on the stage for an hour, and you can say almost anything you want as long as you don't,
Right.
there are certain
Right.
boundaries, and would you say yes to that? If you said no, I'd be like, all right, whatever. I don't know what kind of entrepreneur you are, but I'll do it, right? That's what podcasting is. Somebody's created, they built the stage, they filled the seats with people who are, if you pick the podcast right, in quote,
Yes.
they're just hungry to learn more about what you know, and you just get to walk on the stage, do your thing, and then the host takes the episode, puts in the music, does
Right. All the stuff.
all the stuff
All
for
the
you,
stuff.
and you get a link, and they're going to take it to your audience, plus you get to take it to your audience. And if you're smart, that's a pretty good proposition to like, what other marketing form do you have that opportunity? And by the way, it's super fun. And by the way, you don't have to talk in sound bites. And by the
Yeah.
way, it's one of the most intimate forms of connection on the internet that you could possibly imagine. And by the way, podcast listeners are younger, they more educated, they make more money, and they're early adapters than the
Mm.
average population. They're
Mhm.
looking for new ideas, and they have money to buy what you sell.
Yeah.
If that's not interesting to you,
Right. I
don't be
don't
a
know.
podcast guest, right? You don't want to do it if that, if you want to sell stuff and you want new people to actually fall in love with your new ideas because you don't do it exactly like everybody else is. You definitely don't want to be a pod. If you are interested in innovation and people have money in their
Right.
pocket to spend on your innovative thing, I don't know anything else out there like it.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I mean, it's a great description of really showing how, like, what an easy invitation that is to accept when you look at all the work that goes in. I mean, on the front end of creating one and hosting it and
So
producing it every
much.
week, and then the back end of what happens after the thing is recorded, right? It's so much more than what people see. But yeah, if you're not interested in that, like, okay,
Yeah,
leave room for
that's
the rest
great.
of us.
Exactly.
Totally.
Leave room for that's more room for me. Boy, this past week, Heather, I've had the largest wave of new client inquiries that I've had in at least 5 years.
Well, and I know you've been using it really successfully as a strategy, which is why I wanted to ask you about
Yeah.
it.
And that's
But
because I've been on several pretty well-known higher audience podcasts in the past 2 weeks, and people listened to them and said, I listened to your
yeah,
episode with so-and-so, and I have some, can we talk? Right? And
I
I'm like,
love
come
it.
on down. Of course we could talk.
Yes, no, I love it. And I mean, and it is, somebody has built a platform and you can think of it like a stage. And I also heard somebody describe it like the nature, and this gets to the intimacy portion of the way that podcasts are and how they're listened to. It's really a lot more like having somebody sit down with you at your dinner table,
Totally.
right?
Even more than like being on a stage, I call it a scaled virtual coffee, right? Heather and Paul
Yeah.
talk and we share stories, and Paul tells you about when he had a drunken incident at 17, and Heather tells stories, you know, about her
Yeah.
journey. And
Yes.
it's like the people you would, here's my reference point, Heather. It's like when you go to a conference and you've been in a space for a long time, there's the like, now I'm going to push the button on my TED Talk or my conference keynote. Okay, yeah, when you're first new in your first year or two or three, great. But then there's what happens afterwards at the wine bar, the coffee shop, with the people who are really knowledgeable and been doing it for years. And like, oh yeah, Joe's been doing that talk forever, right? And it's great. But what you're really for is those deep, intimate conversations with
Hmm.
people who know your space after the formal conference is over, right? At this point in my career, that's when there used to be these things called conferences.
Right, right.
That's why I would go, right? That's what podcasting is, but it's scaled and it's inclusive because once we record this, right, it's there, you know,
Yeah.
my podcast, your podcast. If we don't do anything dumb, like not pay our hosting thing, it's there until
Yes.
we stop paying it or until there's not an internet. And anybody with an internet connection can listen to those kind of conversations.
Yeah.
That's how I think about podcasting.
Well, and it's really, and I'm newer to it than you are. Obviously, just over a month in, but I've got my 10th episode just released Tuesday. I can't
Nice.
remember which day of the week we're at. Yes. But I've got
What
like,
year is this?
what
What
year?
planet
I
are we
know.
on?
What day? Is it the middle of the night? Where am I? This is pretty much my
Thank you,
daily.
COVID-19. Yes.
Yes. Where am I exactly? But I've got 25 recorded and edited and in the pipeline. Like that will
Nice.
populate until the end of the year. And so
Oh, you're gonna be at a twice a month schedule.
I think
I mean,
so.
twice a week.
I
You're like,
think
there's all these awesome conversations. I don't want to leave them there for
I
6 months,
know
right?
that's the struggle I'm facing right now is I'm really enjoying it. I'm like, holy cow, I might need to actually convert to, but that said, I'm hopeful that at some point maybe I'll have thousands of downloads. But right now, I'm still really touched even when one person reaches out and says, hey, I listened to your episode from last week and it really, even just one person
Yes.
still makes the work worth it and makes the conversation that much more meaningful. So anyways, all of this is to say I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful that you joined me today. You've got such brilliance to share with people across a variety of topics. Like really you can go deep into the deep meaningful stuff and like all the business fundamentals, and I love that. Where do you like to connect? So for people who are like, hey, I want to follow up with this Paul guy, and for people listening, obviously I'm going to share Paul and all of his links in the show notes at legalwebsitewarrior.com/podcast. But Paul, where do you like to connect?
My social platform of choice is where we met, a LinkedIn, right? So I'm on all the
Awesome.
channels, but LinkedIn is like the place where leaders go.
Yeah.
And you can listen to my podcast at awarepreneurs.com/podcasts. And there's always conversations going on about those episodes and stuff. So
I love that. Well, and for people listening, you definitely should hop over, listen to Paul's podcast. He's a really
go
skilled.
listen to my podcast episode with this fabulous woman named Heather Pierce Campbell. Yeah.
I was going to say skip that one, but listen to all
No,
the
no, no.
others.
You
No, but you are a really gifted host, and I think people would really enjoy listening to you. And so I would love for them to go visit that link. Any final thoughts, Paul, before we sign off? What do you want people to take away?
Oh, just particularly for the folks who listen to this show, please take really good care of yourself. We're in unprecedented times, and the levels of stress and polarization and just economic disruption and, you know, challenges to our health and well-being are unprecedented. Please, whatever good self-care practices you
Mm-hmm.
have, wellness practices, there's never been a more important time to practice that.
Yeah, absolutely. Such a good reminder. Well, Paul, thank you. I appreciate you. I know we're going to be in touch again very soon, but really am grateful to have had you here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Heather. It's been fabulous.